The city just broke a rainfall record that had stood for more than a century and a half. This is not a single, contained flooding event. It's the result of one storm's remnant moisture tearing across an entire region of China. And, as of right now, that same moisture is still moving, still dangerous, and pushing toward new provinces that haven't yet felt the worst of it. Today, we're breaking down exactly what triggered this disaster, why Wuxi specifically was so vulnerable to this kind of flooding, and what the new danger emerging right now actually looks like as the system continues its path north. No exaggeration, just the current reporting and the real scale of what's happening. If you have any connection to this region, tell me in the comments, and subscribe now if you want to keep tracking this story as it develops. Let's get into it. The storm responsible for this disaster is Typhoon Dolphin, and its path into China was unusual from the very start. On Sunday, August 9th, 2026, Dolphin made its first landfall near the town of Kanmen in Yuhuan, Zhejiang province, at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, arriving as a full typhoon with maximum sustained winds of roughly 94 miles per hour and a central atmospheric pressure of 945 hectopascals, according to Chinese state media. That alone would have been a major weather event for the region. But Dolphin wasn't finished. Just over an hour later, at approximately 6:40 that same evening, the storm made a second, separate landfall near Wengyang in Yuqing, farther south along the same stretch of Zhejiang coastline, an unusual double landfall within a single hour that immediately signaled this was not going to be a typical quickly passing storm event. What happened next made the situation genuinely stranger. Rather than continuing on a predictable inland track and gradually weakening, Dolphin moved slowly southwest through the Wenzhou area, crossing through Ruiyang, Pingyang, and Taishun, briefly crossed into neighboring Fujian province, and then curved back into Zhejiang entirely, tracing what Chinese media outlets described as a rare arcing path through the province. That slow, looping trajectory meant the storm spent far longer sitting over and near populated areas of Zhejiang than a typical typhoon would, repeatedly dumping rain over the same general region rather than moving through and clearing out. In Wenzhou specifically, floodwaters rose high enough to reach ground floor window level in parts of the city. In Ningbo, rainfall pushed water levels along the Yong River high enough that authorities formally designated the event the Yong River No. 1 flood of 2026, an official classification reserved for genuinely significant flooding events on that specific river system, reflecting a formal government threshold requiring coordinated response across reservoir management upstream and evacuation planning. Downstream, video circulating from the region showed extreme conditions, exterior walls stripped from high-rise buildings, underground parking garages completely submerged, and floodwater pouring directly into residential buildings. By midday on Monday, August 10th, provincial meteorological authorities confirmed Dolphin had weakened to a tropical storm as it moved over Jiangshan in western Zhejiang, with maximum sustained winds dropping to roughly 45 miles per hour. On paper, that weakening should have meant the worst was over. In practice, it meant almost nothing for the flooding risk, and understanding why requires understanding how a typhoon's destructive power actually breaks down into two largely separate categories: wind and water. Wind damage tends to peak right around landfall and then drops off relatively quickly as a storm loses organization moving inland. Rainfall and flooding risk work completely differently. A weakening tropical system can still be carrying enormous quantities of atmospheric moisture, essentially a massive reservoir of water vapor drawn up from the ocean during the storm's time offshore. And that moisture doesn't disappear just because the storm's internal wind structure has broken down. Instead, it continues moving with whatever remains of the storm's circulation, dumping rain wherever atmospheric conditions push it, often over an area far larger and for far longer than the storm's most intense wind field ever covered. That's exactly the dynamic that turned Dolphin from a typhoon producing dangerous winds along the immediate Zhejiang coastline into a much broader, slower-moving flooding disaster capable of breaking a 150-year rainfall record in Shanghai and threatening 10 separate provinces, stretching hundreds of miles inland. That warning proved accurate almost immediately, and nowhere more dramatically than in Shanghai. On Monday, August 10th, the city recorded what officials described as record-breaking rainfall, with the city's 24-hour precipitation total breaking a record that had stood for more than 150 years. To put that in perspective, that's not a record broken within recent memory, or even within the lifetime of anyone currently living in the city. It's a record that predates most of modern Shanghai's development entirely, broken in a single day by the remnants of a storm that had already made landfall and weakened well before reaching the city. The results were immediate and visible across multiple districts. Floodwaters inundated streets throughout the city, including the popular Wukang Road area, where the historic Wukang Mansion, one of Shanghai's most recognizable heritage buildings, ended up surrounded by standing water. More than 1,000 flights were canceled at Shanghai's airports on Monday alone, as the city's transportation network buckled under the combination of flooding and continued heavy rain, a genuinely significant disruption for a city that functions as one of the busiest aviation hubs anywhere in Asia. The human stories coming out of Shanghai over the following day illustrate exactly what this kind of flooding actually looks like at street level, beyond the raw statistics. One resident described watching water rise to knee level inside homes that had been renovated as recently as a year earlier, saying she had never imagined Shanghai would see this much rain in a single year, and describing entire districts as flooded, with one specific area near the Hongqiao Road subway station transformed into what she called a waterfall. In Shanghai's Pudong district, flooding along Lansun Road became a particular flashpoint for public frustration, after a resident pointed out that the road had just undergone 2 full years of renovations, roadwork, and new drainage pipe construction, and that even heavier rain in the past had never flooded the street this badly. He directly questioned whether something had gone wrong with the infrastructure project itself, a question that resonated widely enough online that it became one of the more widely shared pieces of commentary from the entire flooding event. Near the South Shanxi Road subway station, video showed a luxury handbag and jewelry store completely inundated by water approaching a full meter in depth, with the store's owner estimating the resulting damage at a minimum of 1 million yuan. There's also a claim circulating from the Shanghai flooding that deserves careful, honest treatment rather than either amplification or dismissal. Social media posts alleged that 2 people were electrocuted after floodwater entered a residential building in Shanghai, with video circulating that appeared to show 2 unresponsive men being pulled from a flooded structure. It's important to be direct about the actual status of this claim. It has not been independently verified, and Chinese state media has not publicly confirmed it. The lack of official coverage itself became a point of criticism among some social media users online, who questioned why state-controlled outlets hadn't addressed a claim spreading as widely as this one had. What is universally true, regardless of this specific claim, is that standing water inside occupied buildings carries genuine electrocution risk wherever submerged outlets, appliances, or wiring are involved, which is exactly why cutting power and avoiding contact with floodwater is standard emergency guidance during any major flooding event. Now, to Wuxi specifically, the city at the center of this story and the broader region beyond Shanghai, because the flooding disaster here extends well past any single city. Wuxi, a major industrial city in southern Jiangsu province, sitting along the northern edge of Lake Tai, reported severe waterlogging as dolphins' remnant moisture pushed through the region, with underground parking garages inundated and roads submerged across multiple parts of the city. Wuxi is one of China's most economically significant manufacturing and technology centers, home to a population of more than 7 million people, and a major contributor to the broader Yangtze River Delta economy, which makes disruption to its roads, garages, and transportation infrastructure carry weight well beyond the immediate inconvenience to residents, given how tightly the city's logistics and manufacturing supply chains are woven into the surrounding regional economy. Wuxi's flooding risk isn't purely a function of this one storm either, and understanding the underlying vulnerability matters for grasping why this specific city was hit so hard. Wuxi sits within the Yangtze River Delta, one of the most densely populated and economically significant regions in all of China, built across a landscape historically dominated by an intricate network of canals, rivers, and low-lying agricultural land surrounding Lake Tai, one of China's largest freshwater lakes. Over recent decades, that landscape has been transformed by intensive urban development, with much of the region's traditional water-absorbing wetland and agricultural terrain replaced by paved roads, buildings, and impermeable urban surfaces that simply cannot absorb rainfall the way the natural landscape once did. Academic researchers studying this exact dynamic have specifically flagged Wuxi and its surrounding areas within the northern Taihu Basin as facing severe, chronic flood pressure driven by the combination of climate extremes and the area's rapid, intensive urbanization. Research that found hydraulic connectivity between waterways in the region can actually override natural topographic drainage advantages, transforming even comparatively high elevation parts of the city into unexpectedly vulnerable flood zones. For it is ice. In plain terms, Wuxi's dense network of canals, rivers, and urban waterways, combined with decades of rapid development across the surrounding plain, has created a landscape where flooding can spread and concentrate in ways that don't always follow simple elevation logic, a vulnerability that a storm producing this much sustained rainfall was always going to expose. That research, published earlier this year before Dolphin ever formed, effectively predicted the exact kind of vulnerability the city just experienced. It's worth pausing here to explain exactly why Dolphin's path through Zhejiang turned out to be so unusual, because the specific way it moved is a significant part of why the flooding ended up as severe as it did. Most typhoons making landfall in China follow a comparatively direct path, moving inland and gradually weakening as they lose access to the warm ocean water that fuels their strength. Dolphin's path broke that pattern almost immediately. After its 2 landfalls within a single hour, rather than continuing steadily inland, the storm slowed dramatically and began tracing what Chinese meteorologists themselves described as a rare arc, moving southwest through Wenzhou, crossing several inland districts, briefly exiting into Fujian province, and then curving back into Zhejiang entirely before finally continuing on a more typical inland track. Meteorologists studying typhoon behavior generally attribute this kind of erratic, slow-moving path to weak or shifting steering currents in the upper atmosphere, essentially the broader wind patterns that normally push a storm along a predictable route, losing their grip on the system, leaving it to wander based on smaller, more localized atmospheric influences instead. Every one of those extra hours spent looping back over already soaked Zhejiang terrain represented additional rainfall accumulating on ground that had already absorbed as much water as it reasonably could. Exactly the kind of scenario that turns already serious flooding into the kind of record-breaking event Shanghai ultimately experienced days later, once that same moisture plume finally reached the city. It's also worth putting Shanghai's transportation disruption in context, because 1,000-plus flight cancellations at a single city's airports in one day represents a genuinely enormous logistical event. Shanghai's 2 major airports, Pudong International and Hongqiao, together rank among the busiest aviation hubs anywhere in Asia, handling both massive volumes of domestic Chinese air travel and a significant share of international traffic connecting China to the rest of the world. A disruption of this scale doesn't just strand the passengers directly booked on canceled flights. It ripples outward through connecting itineraries, cargo shipments, and crew scheduling in ways that can take days rather than hours to fully untangle, even after the immediate flooding danger has passed and normal operations technically resume. Let's talk about how Chinese authorities actually classify and respond to a flooding event like the one on the Yong River in Ningbo, because the number 1 flood designation isn't just a dramatic-sounding label, it's part of a formal system. Chinese water resource authorities maintain numbered flood classification systems for major river basins, specifically so emergency responders, upstream reservoir operators, and downstream communities can communicate quickly and precisely about exactly how serious a given flood event is relative to that river's own historical record. Designating an event as the first flood of the year on a specific river signals that water levels have crossed a formally defined threshold requiring coordinated response across multiple agencies, from reservoir management upstream to evacuation planning downstream. That kind of formal numbered classification is a big part of why China's evacuation numbers during major flooding events, more than 1 million people moved during this single storm alone, can happen as quickly and as broadly as they do, because the trigger points for large-scale coordinated action are defined and rehearsed well in advance rather than improvised in the moment. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here. Because Wuxi's vulnerability isn't unique to this one city, it reflects a challenge playing out across the entire Yangtze River Delta, and, more broadly, across many of China's fastest-growing urban regions. The same forces reshaping Wuxi's flood risk, rapid conversion of natural water-absorbing terrain into impermeable urban surfaces, combined with increasingly extreme rainfall events tied to broader shifts in regional weather patterns, are actively playing out in dozens of other Chinese cities built across similarly low-lying, historically water-rich landscapes. That's precisely why the academic research, flagging Wuxi's specific vulnerability earlier this year, matters beyond just this one city's story. Barter. It represents exactly the kind of forward-looking, evidence-based warning that flood engineers and urban planners across the broader region are increasingly trying to get ahead of, even as storms like Dolphin continue arriving faster than that infrastructure work can fully keep pace with. Here is where the new danger actually enters this story, because the threat hasn't passed, it's moved. Despite Dolphin's own wind speeds continuing to weaken well below typhoon strength, Chinese forecasters have been explicit that the storm's remaining moisture is expected to keep pushing north, threatening Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, Shandong, and neighboring areas with an increased risk of flash floods, landslides, and further urban flooding in the days ahead. Beyond Wuxi and Shanghai, heavy rainfall and flooding were also reported across parts of Zhejiang, Anhui, Hubei, and Henan as Dolphin's remnants continued pushing inland, and Chinese authorities issued weather alerts covering at least 10 separate provinces and municipalities altogether: Zhejiang, Shanghai, Jiangsu, Anhui, Hubei, Henan, Shandong, Hunan, Jiangxi, and Fujian. Forecasters specifically flagged Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Anhui, Henan, and Hubei as facing the risk of exceptionally heavy rainfall, with isolated areas of northern Hubei projected to receive as much as 250 to 270 millimeters, roughly 10 inches, of rain within a single 24-hour period. That's the kind of rainfall total capable of producing serious flash flooding almost anywhere it falls, let alone across a region already saturated by days of continuous storm activity. This inland push carries its own distinct category of danger, separate from the urban flooding already documented in Shanghai and Wuxi, because mountainous and hilly terrain across provinces like Hubei, Henan, and Anhui introduces a landslide risk that flat, low-lying coastal cities simply don't face in the same way. When ground already saturated by days of rain receives an additional burst of intense rainfall, the risk shifts from standing water in streets and garages to the ground itself losing structural integrity. A genuinely different and, in many ways, more sudden, less predictable hazard than urban flooding. Chinese meteorological authorities have specifically paired their heavy rainfall warnings for these inland provinces with explicit landslide risk alerts, reflecting exactly that shift in the nature of the danger as dolphins' moisture moves away from the coast and into more topographically varied terrain further inland. The evacuation numbers behind this entire event underscore just how seriously Chinese authorities treated the threat even before the worst of the inland flooding had fully developed. More than 1 million people were evacuated across areas in the storm's path, spanning Zhejiang, Shanghai, and Fujian provinces. Wenzhou alone accounted for more than 900,000 of those evacuations, while Fujian saw nearly 99,000 people relocated as a precaution, even though the storm's most direct impact ultimately concentrated in Zhejiang rather than sweeping further south into Fujian itself. That scale of evacuation, more than 1 million people moved out of harm's way across a handful of provinces within a matter of days, reflects the kind of rapid, large-scale emergency response infrastructure China has built specifically to handle exactly this category of storm, even as the flooding that followed demonstrated just how difficult it remains to fully protect dense, heavily developed urban areas from rainfall totals this extreme. It's worth drawing a direct comparison to how China's worst recent flooding disasters unfolded, because it helps calibrate exactly how serious this week's events actually are relative to the country's own recent history. The 2021 floods centered on Jiangsu and Henan province killed dozens of people, including passengers trapped in a flooded subway system, an event that became one of the most closely scrutinized flooding disasters in recent Chinese history, precisely because of questions about early warning systems and evacuation timing. The 2023 floods, centered on Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei, killed at least 81 people and left dozens more missing, and required authorities to deliberately divert more than 1 billion cubic meters of floodwater into designated storage areas, specifically to protect the capital region. As of the most recent reporting on this week's flooding, the confirmed death toll directly tied to Dolphin's China landfall remains far lower than either of those prior disasters, with the electrocution claim from Shanghai specifically remaining unverified rather than officially confirmed. That's a genuinely important distinction to hold on to. This week's flooding, while severe and disruptive across an enormous geographic area, has not yet produced anything approaching the confirmed casualty figures of China's worst recent flooding disasters, even as the economic disruption, transportation chaos, and property damage have clearly been extensive across Shanghai, Wuxi, and the broader region. That said, the fact that this storm's moisture is now approaching Beijing, the exact region devastated by the 2023 disaster, means officials in the capital area are almost certainly treating this system with heightened caution given that recent painful precedent. There's also a broader question this event has reopened across Chinese social media, and it's worth taking seriously rather than treating as incidental online commentary. The specific frustration expressed by the Lankun Road resident in Shanghai, questioning why 2 full years of drainage infrastructure renovation failed to prevent flooding that past storms hadn't produced, reflects a genuine recurring tension in how China's wealthiest, most heavily developed cities are handling increasingly extreme rainfall events. That tension isn't new this year either. Earlier this summer, flood survivors in Guangxi province publicly disputed official casualty figures following a dam collapse they described as a man-made disaster rather than a purely natural one, a controversy that had already put Chinese flood infrastructure and disaster response under public scrutiny well before Dolphin ever formed in the Pacific. Shanghai is widely regarded as one of the country's most economically important and most heavily invested in cities, and the sight of newly renovated streets flooding this severely has visibly renewed public scrutiny of whether current drainage infrastructure investment is actually keeping pace with the kind of rainfall intensity storms like Dolphin are now capable of producing, a question that extends well beyond this single storm and touches on how Chinese cities more broadly are adapting, or struggling to adapt, to a pattern of increasingly extreme weather events. So where does this leave things right now as this update goes up? The immediate flooding crisis in Wuxi and Shanghai remains an active recovery situation, with underground garages still being pumped out, roads still being cleared, and residents still assessing property damage across both cities. But the more urgent, forward-looking danger has shifted geographically, away from the Yangtze Delta cities that bore the initial brunt of Dolphin's landfall, and toward the provinces now sitting directly in the path of the storm's remaining moisture as it pushes north. Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, Shandong, and the mountainous inland provinces of Hubei, Henan, and Anhui are the places to watch over the coming days, facing a combination of continued flash flood risk and, in hillier terrain, a genuine landslide danger that adds an entirely new category of hazard to a disaster that started as a coastal typhoon landfall nearly a week ago at this point. We will keep tracking this story as Dolphin's remnant moisture continues pushing north, and as new reporting comes in from Beijing, Tianjin, and the surrounding region. Given the 10 provinces already under weather alerts and the rainfall totals still forecast for northern Hubei and beyond, this is very much a live, still developing disaster rather than one nearing resolution. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening across eastern China right now, subscribe so you don't miss the next update. And drop a comment letting me know if you have any connection to the affected region. Stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.